It all began with a simple invitation to follow. He promised our lives would change. For some reason, we left it all and went after him. When he spoke, it was as if lightning was striking, but at the same time, you knew you were loved. He would heal anyone. Nervous wrecks and outcasts with boils and broken limbs, nothing threatened him. And being close to him felt like freedom. The longer we were with him, the more he talked about a cross, waiting off in the future. We didn't understand, but we knew that if he was gone, what point would there be to any of this? And then it happened. Nails, a cross, soldiers in the heat of day, and finally, death. We couldn't believe it at first, but death didn't have the last word. He dealt death a fatal shot. He rose. The tomb was empty. We touched his scars. We saw his face. He invited us to keep following Jesus, the Servant King.
When I was an undergrad, the spring quarter of my junior year, I somehow convinced my professors to let me out of school 2 weeks early, but not just that, but to grade me on what I had accomplished at that point in the quarter and to not hold what I had not accomplished against me. I don't know how I did it. I should have paid more attention. It would have served me well throughout my life, but I did it. I was flying to South Africa. At first, I told my mom, I'm going to buy a one-way ticket. I'm going to go and I'm going to see what happened. And my mom, with a little bit of pause on the other end of the phone line, said, well, let's just try a month. So I, appeasing her, said, oh, fine, we'll do a month. But still, I got out of my lease agreement and I quit my job. Why? Because this girl named Candace, she was serving as a missionary at a missions base there in South Africa, and I loved her for approximately 3 years, and I'd been dating her for approximately 2 months. And there was this opportunity to visit her. I think that my resting heart rate in the surrounding weeks of the trip was around 105. It just didn't go down. I was stoked. I was elated. And add that to the fact that I was bringing a ring along with me. You see, the thing is that we had talked about marriage once. But she seemed favorable, and I'd convinced my professors to get me out early, so I saw good things waiting for me. And it was crazy how God kept on giving all these signs, listen to the radio, and all of a sudden there's a song about love. It was crazy. God was clearly giving me signs, walking downtown, and then there's a bridal shop there. Clearly another sign. God was just relentless in his pursuit of letting me know I should propose. I saw it all. I saw it all downfield, as it were. 2.5 kids, a lifetime of bliss, the possibility of a dog. It was all waiting for me. Well, after a 22-hour flight and some confusion about where my luggage was, I saw her. She saw me. You see, we began dating, weirdly enough, when she was in South Africa, though we had known each other for a long time. And I don't know if you can actually date when you're in different continents, but that's what we said we were. We were dating. We were a couple. And this was the first time we had seen each other since this climactic move of us becoming a couple, because there was no FaceTime, there was no Skype. I'm that old. And so we saw each other for the first time, and I ran in slow motion towards her, and she walked casually towards me. And we hugged for the first time as a couple. And I had the ring in my pocket because it was expensive, $500 to be exact. And I didn't want that at risk in any luggage or bag, so it was there, the jewelry case protruding out of my tan Dockers. And we were dropped off later in the day at a Cape Town beach. We were holding our sandals in our hand as the surf washed over our feet. The sun was going down, and we were holding hands for the first time. And I knew I had a month to ask the question, but this felt like the time. First day, within an hour or so of landing. It was all clear. There was a voice in my head. It was saying, if not now, when? Look at the sunset. Look at the water. Look at this woman. Oh, mercy. So we eventually sat down there among the reeds off a distance so that the shore or the water wouldn't get us. And I slowly pulled the ring out of my pocket. And I looked at her, opened the jewelry case, and I said, will you marry me? There was this silence. And then there was a gulp. Then I had a gulp. She said, well, yeah, yes. And I didn't know what to say to that. I was prepared for lots of things, as long as they are variations of the word yes, but not that variation. I said, well, if you're not ready, then, she said, okay, fine, good. The answer's no then, I'm not ready. By the time I opened my email, because that was how you communicated back, and then there was none of that text messaging and stuff. There was like 30 emails from friends. What did she say? Oh, I know. I thought that by the end of the month, my capacities for wooing would win the day. But I came home with the ring. You know, it's crazy how sometimes we can go from this mountaintop experience to a valley experience. Have you ever been jolted, kind of like a roller coaster ride with like this exciting, like, yeah, what? Then zoom. But there's no fun, you're not seatbelted in, and it's real life we're talking about. Mountains and valleys. Mountains and valleys. High heights, low valleys. Every one of our lives in here. Mark my words, every one of your lives. No one of us is protected from a valley. And if you're in a valley, I can assure you, you'll experience a mountaintop. There's the highs of career advancement or childbirth, maybe a first home purchase, and the lows of physical injury, marital strain, financial struggles. They come after every one of us, highs and lows. We are a people of high peaks and low valleys. Here's the good news, is that God is a God of high peaks and low valleys. There is this myth that, like, if we're really following God, then we should only experience high peaks. Let me just tell you, that's bad theology. It's not close Bible reading. It's not paying attention to what actual life happens. Good people find themselves in the valley that find themselves close to Jesus. They find themselves in the valley. And sometimes total mess ups, I don't know, whatever word you want to fill in, they find themselves at the high peaks. Life is composed of highs and lows and mountains and valleys. You see, we're starting this teaching series today called The Servant King, where we'll look at the life of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark throughout the next couple months. It's going to take us all the way to Easter. And we pick it up right here in the middle of the Gospel of Mark. We chose to focus on the second half of the Gospel so we could have a really close look at the path towards the cross and the empty tomb. And today we see this rapid movement from a high peak to a low valley in the life of the disciples. It's going to be in Mark chapter 9, verses 2 to 13. The last couple verses aren't on the screen, so you'll have to trust me, or you can, actually open your Bible. Cheeky pastor comment. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. And then a cloud appeared and covered them, and the voice came from the cloud, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, "Why do teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they've done to him everything they wished, just as is written about them." We're going to be looking at, as I mentioned, this in this story, and we're going to see how this story shares about this rapid movement from a high peak into a low valley. And we're going to be learning from the disciples what it looks like to stay close to the God of the peaks and the God of the valleys in the midst of our peaks, in the midst of our valleys. First, let's look at the highest peak. As it begins with this high moment, this big moment. And some of it might not be readily available. So I want to kind of spend some time like zeroing in, microscoping in on the passage so that we can appreciate kind of the richness that's being communicated there in the first part of that passage we read. You see, Jesus invited a couple people on this amazing, eye-popping adventure. It was exclusive access. Not all the 12 got invited, only some, Peter, James, and John. Can you imagine being like Matthew? Like, me too, okay. Peter, James, and John got these badges, like that said behind stage access. And Jesus invited them up on this mountaintop moment. Must have been cool for Peter, James, and John, And they were up there, they saw something that must have just been amazing. It says that Jesus was transfigured. Now, I've never met anyone that's been transfigured. I've seen some movies where something close to that happens, but this was significant. I mean, there's actually nothing in all of the Bible that comes close to describing something like here. Nothing comes close to what happened to Jesus here. And Peter, James, and John got this front row, behind the scenes experience of it all. Jesus was transfigured. It says his clothing became like whiter than white, like whiter than you could bleach them. Like Clorox does not stand a chance. There was like this meaning, like there's this light emanating. It was so bright. It was blindingly bright. It was coming from him. It was emitting from him. It wasn't something that wasn't a light reflected off him. It was coming right from him. Imagine blinking and I need to see it, but blinking and averting your eyes and this rhythm of back and forth. The disciples stunned and amazed. And then there's these 2 characters that show up, Elijah and Moses. Now, in a room like this, there's people that have all sorts of different levels of Bible knowledge. So I want to press into this because it's actually quite important for us to understand, every one of us to be on the same page. You see, Elijah was a prophet in the Old Testament. And oftentimes he was described as kind of like the ultimate prophet or the example of what a prophet was or who a prophet is. So Elijah, we can understand, was the stand-in, the symbol of all of Old Testament prophecy standing right next to Jesus there. And Moses, he was the symbol or the stand-in for all the Old Testament law. Now, when you think about the Old Testament, the major components of the Old Testament are the law and the prophets. So Elijah and Moses, what are they doing here? Why did they just show up when Jesus was transfigured? It's as if Mark is telling us. It's as if reality is showing the original disciples that were present that all of the Old Testament, it points to Jesus. The law and the prophets, it points to Jesus. That Jesus is more than a nice rabbi that had some good sayings and some supernatural abilities, but that this is the Son of God that all of Scripture points to. But even more, check this out. You see, when you follow the life of Elijah, one of the highlights, the main points of his life is when he meets God on a mountain and God speaks to Elijah there on that mountain. And one of the high points of Moses' life is when he meets God on a mountain and God speaks to Moses. Now take a step back, look at this passage. What's happening here? Jesus is speaking to Elijah and Moses on a mountain. What does that mean? Is that in the past, we know Elijah has spoke to God or talked with God at a mountain, and Moses talked with God. Now Jesus is speaking to them. This is more than a rabbi. This is God speaking to Elijah and Moses. And if you're a first century Jew, if you're Peter, James, and John, all of this comes rapid fire. This is not just something that's like, oh, we have to strain and squint, but they understand it because they're people of the word. They understand the Old Testament scriptures, and they're amazed and awestruck not just by the gleams of light, but what the meaning is. Because here's the thing, up until this point, one of the major questions of who is this Jesus? Everybody's trying to figure it out. And here, right in front of Peter, James, and John, we're given the most clear answer that this is no one else but God himself, right before you. What a moment. It makes sense why Peter would say, Rabbi, let's never leave here, ever. In fact, I'm willing to build a home for all three of you. Let's just stay here. But it's interesting how Jesus doesn't allow that. God doesn't allow that. That's not how it happens. We're taken from this high peak, the highest peak, to this low valley pretty quickly. The lowest valley. You see, what happens is as they start walking down literally into the valley, is that they start kind of questioning, like, wait, okay, there is something about rising from the dead, and wait, there's something about like Son of Man suffering, and like, okay, like. You see, Jesus had already in Matthew chapter 8 said he was going to die. And like, think about the jarring reality. I mean, like Jesus says, hey, I'm going to die. And the next thing, you're up on top of a mountain and there's this fireworks show. And the whole point of the message is that you're with the one who is divine. And they're like, wait. If this is who you really are, then why do you have to die? For us, we know the whole story. We get it, we've read it, and some of us who've been to church for a long time, it's actually, we have to kind of like unbore it. We have to try to like make it not boring because we're so familiar with it. The problem is for us is that we're too familiar with it. But the first disciples is that they're not that familiar with it. They're getting it like right there, second by second. And like what they've seen of Jesus is that Jesus has transformed their life, and he said he's gonna die, and like why? Jesus, don't. Because if you're gone, then so is my purpose. It would seem to be. This is a low valley. And you see, they're arguing in those verses 9 to 12 and discussing like what, he said resurrection, but like, wait, what, huh? They don't quite get it. What they do get is that they moved from a high peak into a low valley. And that they're slowly moving towards Jerusalem, where Jesus has said, and over the next 2 chapters, he'll say 2 more times that he is gonna die. The good news for us is that we get the whole picture, and we can understand the whole picture, that it doesn't end in death, and we can understand, for our sake, what it looks like for us to be close to the God of peaks and valleys. The God of both peaks and valleys. Over my years as a college pastor, I was a college pastor for 10 years, if you didn't know that. And it's interesting, the first couple years in, I started to learn this trend with college students, The thing was, the trend that I saw was that there were 2 particular seasons that seemed to cause like everyone's faith to kind of like nearly, be challenged, I'll say. And the two seasons would come every year. It was predictable. They were summer and it was winter. Summer and winter both presented these unique challenges to everyone's faith, or to most people's faith. Summer, it became obvious, was a challenge to these college students' faith because, all year, the 9 months, you'd been practicing this rhythm of classes and oftentimes school and friendship networks that were growing with increasingly tightness and richness. And all of a sudden, in summer, that goes away. And the rhythm and infrastructure that had been propping up your faith and your community was taken away. And oftentimes there would be wandering and stretching and loneliness in summer. Now, the interesting thing is that most times in spring, if you ask any of those college students what they were looking forward to, they would say summer. Summer was, and for many of us here, the highest peak. But for them, what they found out was the highest peak offered a considerable challenge. And similarly, really actually the opposite, winter. Winter, the cold temperatures and the clouds came out, and so did everyone else's seasonal affective disorder, The high and the buzz of fall and the excitement had been worn off, and there was just cold temperatures and closed doors and a lack of vitamin D and finals and all of that, and it was a challenge equally to everyone's discipleship to Jesus and their health. What I came to realize is that the high peaks and the low valleys equally presented significant challenges to everyone's faith, but presented significant opportunities to everyone's faith. Which is, again, contrary to wisdom. We typically are conventional wisdom. We think that if we finally get to the highest, then everything will be great and we don't have to worry anymore. No, there's a temptation and a challenge waiting there. And this insight has only deepened since stepping into this role at Anchor. It's the low valley of a relapse that causes the shame to overcome and keeps us from continuing with Celebrate Recovery. Start slipping away from community. Or it's the high peak of financial success that tempts you towards independence and away from generosity. You see, the risk of the mountain is to place your hope in the moment. Is to shift your focus from God to the success that you're experiencing. And the risk of the valley is to lose your hope because of the moment. They both present equal challenge, but they both present equal opportunity. Going back to the story, like Peter, like we've talked about already, he wants to build 3 shelters. He wants to pull out the hammer, he wants to pull out the skill saw, and he wants to just put something together for Elijah and Moses and Jesus. And like why does he want to do it? He knows that Jesus has already said the cross is coming, and he wants to circumnavigate that by just staying camped out here at this high moment. He wants to preserve the high moment. What is he doing? He's stopped focusing on Jesus. He's started focusing on this great feeling we're all feeling right here. He shifted towards the moment and away from the person. And it's interesting right there in that particular moment where Peter shifts his focus from Jesus to the success and the goodness and the greatness and the good vibes. When he shifts his focus, what does God do? God interrupts Peter. Isn't that funny? Get that? God says, almost right on the heels of Peter talking, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Now, if you're familiar with the scriptures, and again, I want us to be all on the same page. If you're familiar with the scriptures, like in the very beginning of the Gospel of Mark, there's something that's very similar to what God just says there, what the Father says there. The Father says when Jesus is baptized, "You are my son, whom I love. With you I'm well pleased." Here, though, he says something very similar, but there's a key difference. He says, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." You see, in the very beginning of the Gospel of Mark, the Father is speaking directly to the Son, to Jesus. You are my Son. Don't forget you are my Son. Don't forget that I love you. Don't forget that I delight in you. But here he's speaking to the disciples. This is my Son. This is the one I love. Listen to him. These three sentences each give us something different to reflect on. One, identity. This is my Son. If you have questions about who to follow, he's the one to follow. Second, affection. Whom I love. If you want to be aligned with me, this is the one that I love. And then command. Listen to him. Obeying him is faithfulness to me. It's as if God the Father is communicating to Peter and James and John, make no mistake, this is a great experience, but he is greater. He's greater than the highest peak. He's greater than the lowest low. He's the one that I have chosen to give direction to the whole world and take the world's sin on his shoulders and then rise again. He's the one. He's the one. He's the one. Never mistake a low for being greater than God. Don't lose your hope because of the moment. Never mistake a high peak being greater than God. Don't lose your hope in him and place your hope somewhere else. Don't make that mistake. The Father is saying that there is no one that is comparable. There's no thing that's comparable. Jesus is the direction setter. He's the one worthy of our affection, our attention. He's the one. So there, it makes sense. The very next verse, it says, suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. The second they started placing their hope, at least Peter, the second they started placing their hope in the moment and not in the person, the Father took all that moment away. And there was just Jesus. Is Jesus enough? Is Jesus enough? They're asking. Is Jesus enough? Yeah, here's the thing. I believe that God is not just saying that to those disciples there. He's saying it to all the 12, and he's saying it to every disciple since. He's asking us, do you know that this is my Son, and this is the one that I love? Listen to him. Don't follow after your perfect theology. Don't follow after wealth. Don't follow after, well, whatever is success. Don't follow after any of these things, and don't lose your hope in any of these things. The absence of success, the absence of community, the struggle with an addiction. Don't lose your hope here and don't misguide your hope or shift your hope here. Jesus is the one. I believe that God the Father is speaking that word to every disciple, ever. I remember when the last day of that month-long trip, I still was holding out hope that in the airport she would say yes, because I'd seen enough romantic comedies, and it always ends up in the airport. I knew, I'd studied those romantic comedies, which are a pure parallel for real life, and I knew. But I also knew it probably wasn't that likely. I remember reading my Bible that morning, the night before I flew out, and there's this passage where Jesus says to someone, he says, don't be afraid, just believe. Now, here's what I want. I would love for every one of us. I would love for every one of us to have a moment like I had there. Because the words jumped out of the page and slapped me in the face, and it was as if God the Father, through the Spirit, the Son, were saying to me, don't be afraid, Bryan, just believe. Don't be afraid about the 1,000 conversations you're going to have, and you're going to feel like a total loser, and it's going to feel like junk over and over again. Don't be afraid about the vulnerability of stepping into relationships and all those emails you didn't respond to. Don't be afraid, just believe. Don't be afraid of the valley. God's not afraid of the valley. Right. Don't be afraid of the valley. Just believe. I underlined it. I highlighted it. I wrote in the margin right next to it. And later in the day, Candace and I were walking there in this city just outside of Cape Town, and there's this taxi cab that God used in my life. God ever use a taxi cab in your life? It drove by, and it parked right in front of us, and it had that verse on it. Don't be afraid, just believe. It was the only part of the verse. Don't be afraid, just believe. Don't be afraid of the valley. God's not afraid of the valley. He's there up on the peak. He's there down in the valley. Don't be afraid, just believe. The temptation would have been for me to be obviously afraid and not believe, and hide from everyone that might ask me to tell the story again, and retract into myself and not engage in community for fear of what might people think of me. But the invitation was to believe that the valley didn't define who I was. And really, kind of the peak didn't ultimately define who I was either. Jesus defined who I was. And the cool thing is that word from the Father there that was said to Peter, James, and John, that I believe is saying that God's invitation is for all of us to hear this word. This is my son, whom I love, listen to him. There's magic that happens. There's Holy Spirit magic that happens when you let the Son speak to you through the power of the Spirit in the midst of the valley and on the highest peak. You see, if I didn't listen to the Son, if I didn't listen to God in that valley, I would have been deprived of wisdom. You know, I think that I've met a wise person that has not experienced pain. I've never met a wise person that has not entered through a valley. Wisdom is almost uniquely found through valleys when you're listening to God in the valley. The valleys can make you jerks and mean-spirited and cynical, but when you listen to God in the valley, you become wise. Because I listened to God in the valley, I grew in self-awareness and away from impulsivity. 2 months in proposing, one conversation, Bryan. But I listened to God in the valley. Because I listened to God in the valley, I grew in my communication abilities. I recognized that there were gaps in my life that were not worked on yet, that I needed to grow in how I communicated and how I talked and how I just basic communication. Because I listened to God in the valley, I grew in my patience. I was a person that loved God and incredibly impatient as well. And I grew in patience because I listened to God in the valley. You see, one of the primary works of God is to turn our attention from the distractions of our life, whether they be in the valleys or the peaks, to shift them to himself so that we can have the courage to face our life with God's strength. If you are at a high peak, he's working. He might be forming an attitude of thankfulness in you if you would listen to him at the peak. If you're at a high peak, he's working. He might be causing you to become a blessing in a way you have not become in your life up to this point. If you are in a valley, he is working. He most likely is deepening the work of godly dependence in your life so that you can say, Jesus, you are enough. If you are in a valley, he is working. If you're listening, forming a heart of faith, growing you in wisdom, growing you in patience. The thing is, listen to him. Will you listen to him? Now, the band can come up. The cool thing is about our faith, about the Christian faith, that is unlike any other faith, is that at the center of the Christian faith is Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ did not consider himself too good didn't protect himself from the valleys himself. But he stepped into life and experienced high highs, but he also experienced the lowest valley, where on the cross, he took the full weight of our brokenness and our pain, all those things that we've done, that we've hidden away, that we haven't told anyone about, all of those things. He took them on himself so that we might be free. so that our mistakes wouldn't define us, so that the valley moment could be restorative and transforming. But it didn't stop there. 3 days later, there's an empty tomb where Jesus showed us the highest peak ever, the defeat of death. And both of these things, this low valley of the cross and this high peak of the empty tomb, are at the center of our faith. And when we walk through our low valleys, we know Jesus has gone lower for us. And when we have our high peaks, we know that Jesus has gone higher. He's worthy of worship and always our attention. We celebrate every week an opportunity to be reminded of the depth of God's valley with communion. And you'll hear Christ's body given for you, Christ's blood shed for you. These are reminders of the depth of his love that's given for you, irrespective of whether you're on a mountaintop or in a valley. And before we step into communion and prayer, I want to give this invitation. The music's just going to play like this for a bit. They might start singing, they might not. But I want to give you a unique opportunity this morning to listen to him. Just to create a little space for you to listen to the Holy Spirit right here. You might be in a valley, you might be in a peak, but God wants to speak. And here's the thing, you can listen to him, create some space to listen to him. Clear the critic out of your head. Don't let the critic keep you from hearing him. Just write down what you say on a notes app or some note paper, or just keep it in your head, and then do the courageous thing of following his lead later on in the day as you go out into the world. Obey him. Obey what he tells you. So I'm going to leave some space. Band will continue to pray or continue to play. But make some space right now just to listen to him. Quiet your heart and listen to him. And I'll pray for us. Holy God, speak. Speak. Your call towards the disciples and every disciple since was listen to him. Listen to him. We're listening, God. We're listening, God. Our hearts are quiet. Our hearts are open. Speak. Speak. Speak.